All right. Hi again, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our live webinar where we'll cover everything you need to know about technical SEO. My name is Caroline Cox. I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at HawkSEM, and I will be hosting today's webinar. I'll introduce you to our amazing presenter, Justine, in just a bit. But first, a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So today's webinar is using the Zoom platform, which I'm sure you're very familiar with by now. You can join the audio from your computer, your laptop, tablet, phone, whatever works for you. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box that should be on the lower side of your Zoom panel. We'll have a Q&A section at the end where Justine will address these questions if she didn't get to them in the presentation. And so this webinar is being recorded, and we'll share a link to the recording within the next few days. So let's get started. Yeah, you saw the run of show, so we're doing the intro now. I'm going to cover who we are briefly. We'll hop into her presentation, and then we'll have a quick recap at the end, and then jump into the Q&A. So a little bit about HawkSEM really quick. We are a full service digital marketing agency. These are just some of the services we offer, everything from paid search and social media ads to shopping feeds, and of course, SEO and content marketing as well. And of course, there are a lot of agencies out there, so why are we different? The first is our conversion IQ system. So that's our patent pending smart way of marketing, and it ensures we're always focused on revenue and not just traffic. We're all marketing scientists, so we don't have a separate dedicated analytics team because everyone on our team, every account manager is a data-driven marketing scientist. We also only employ senior managers, and that means we don't have any junior marketers working on accounts. It's all senior talent. We are strategists who execute, so we don't just give you a to-do list and say, good luck. We actually come up with those best practices and then make them happen for you. And then lastly, we really focus on the human touch. So we don't just set it and forget it. We're always iterating and testing new things on campaigns. And lastly, we have extensive expertise across lead gen, e-commerce, and others. We work with companies like Sierra Nevada University, Escape the Room, Blue Sky, and Verizon Media, among others that are shown here. So now I'll introduce Justine Rabideau. She is a lead strategist here at HawkSEM. She's worked in digital marketing for more than 6 years with clients across multiple verticals from healthcare and hospitality to finance, e-commerce, education, and more. Super data driven, and she's an expert in SEO, PPC, social media, and content marketing. So she's got a lot of great stuff to share today. And then when she's not working, she likes running, cooking, and reading. And before I pass it to Justine, we're just going to do a quick poll just to kind of gauge everyone's current level of SEO knowledge, technical knowledge. And of course, there's like no right answer. All of the content today will be for all levels. So no matter where you are, I think you'll definitely get something out of today's content. So I'm going to give this a few more seconds for people to respond, and then I'll share the anonymous results. Let's see, just a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll now. So it looks like we have a good mix. Most people are intermediate, but we've got, every level here. So that's great. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Justine.
Awesome. Thank you for the intro, Caroline. So today we're going to talk about the lesser known side of search engine optimization, and that's technical SEO. So although a lot of SEOs believe that technical SEO is just as important and arguably even more so important than content and on-site SEO, it tends to be the piece that gets ignored by companies and marketing teams because it's much more difficult to understand. But if your technical SEO is in tip-top shape, you can definitely see huge improvements in some of your most important SEO KPIs. And in fact, in a survey by G2, enterprise brands named technical SEOs as their most successful SEO strategy. So let's dive into some of the most important steps in improving your technical SEO health. So before we jump in, I just want to mention that there's a lot of tools out there that can help you assess your website's technical SEO health. So your first step should always be to conduct an SEO audit specific to your website. And a true SEO technical audit is a mix of manual walkthrough coupled with the use of these tools. So in this example, I'm using SEMrush. Screaming Frog is another great one. There's tons of them out there. And you should also register your Google Search Console and Big Master Tools profiles if you haven't already. These are extremely powerful tools that are free for anybody who has a website, And I'm going to reference them several times throughout this presentation. So if you don't already have those, would definitely recommend setting those up as well. And this is a list of some of the things that these tools identify when they do crawl your site and run the technical audit. So a lot of this is probably very jargony. If you're, kind of at the beginner or intermediate level, some of this might not be super clear to you. But that's why we're going to walk through in our presentation some of these items and some of the most important ones that if your site is being flagged for them, we're addressing them. And I also just want to note, this should never be a one and done exercise. It's important to crawl your site regularly in case new issues pop up, because that does tend to happen. All right, so let's jump in. So once you've done the site crawl, you've run your site through whatever tool you decide or tools, we need to decide, okay, what's the most important things that we need to fix here? What are the most pressing technical SEO issues? So we're going to cover some of the basics here and some best practices so that you not only understand the issues on your site, but you know how to fix them. So we have this webinar broken up into 3 key sections: crawling and indexing, user experience, and website architecture. So let's jump into the crawling and indexing section. What we're going to focus on here is why technical SEO is important. So this section is going to help you better understand how search bots interact with your website and how to make it easier for them to crawl, understand, and index your pages. I just want to preface this section by saying it's going to be the most technical and jargony heavy section, so bear with me as we talk through some of this. Okay, so just to take a step back here, Google has billions of pages in its index, and Google, as well as other search engines, have their own proprietary bots, also called spiders, that they send out to crawl websites. So when they're actually doing this, when they go out and they crawl, they don't see web pages the same way that humans do. If you actually view the source code on your site, which we'll look at an example here in a second, you'll see what the bots are actually crawling and what they're seeing when they do so. A lot of companies out there think that if they just produce really great content, Google's going to find it, rank it, and the traffic will just come. But many marketers and business owners lack this basic understanding of how search bots actually crawl, render, and index your pages. And if a bot can't find or understand your pages, even if your content's the best written content on the internet, there's no way it's going to rank in the search results. So that's why it's really, really important to have this understanding of how the bots crawl and what we can do to improve how they understand our web pages. So I referenced source code on the last slide. This is an example of what source code looks like. If you're not a programmer, it probably looks a little bit like gibberish to you, or maybe even another language, and that's because it is. But this is the language that the search bots speak, and again, it's how they understand the content on your website. So having a basic understanding of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS is really key to understanding basic technical SEO. It's also why it's important, if you're working on your technical SEO, to have a web developer and potentially also an SEO as well focused on this, because they're experts and they can have an easier time understanding this than you might if you're just a business owner or a content marketer, things like that. Okay, so it's important to remember that even though search engines are very powerful, their bots can only crawl a finite number of pages across the internet. And this also includes your website. So you want to make sure that they're crawling the most important and high quality pages on your site, and they're not wasting time on low quality pages. So in the SEO world, we refer to this as crawl budget. And this screenshot here shows your crawl stats within Google Search Console. And you can see how many pages are crawled each day. You'll also see it gives you a high, average, and low for the last 30 days. And the reason that this is important, especially for large websites, is if you have thousands of pages, but you review your crawl stats and see Google's only crawling a small portion of them each day, it means they're missing out on big parts of your site. Could also mean that they're missing if you're regularly updating your content, which you should be, and they're just not crawling it, then that's going to take a long time for that to be reflected in the search engine result pages, or SERPs. So you can improve your crawl budget by excluding crawlers from irrelevant pages. This could include anything from admin or login pages to thank you or confirmation pages, paginated pages, testing and development pages. We don't want people to see pages that are not supposed to be seen. Also PPC landing pages. Typically these are meant for a very specific purpose. They're not meant to be seen by somebody who just comes to your site via organic search. And a lot of times they can have duplicate content to some of your other pages. So again, these are just examples. There's lots of other types of pages you might not want the bots to crawl, but these are some of the most common ones. Okay, so we know how many pages the bots are crawling, but how do I know which pages are being indexed? There's a very simple solution for this. If you do a site : search for your domain, you'll see a full list of pages that Google has indexed for your site. And this is where you want to look and see, are these the pages that I actually want to be indexed? Are there things in here I do not want to be indexed, such as some of those examples we talked about on the last slide? Is Google missing an entire section of my site? If you click through all of these paginated results down here and you don't see a single blog post, that means Google's not crawling and indexing your blog post. So there might be some issues there, especially if you want it crawled and indexed, which I would guess that you do. So this is, again, an important exercise to do regularly, just to make sure that your site is being properly indexed. And if not, then we'll want to make sure that we remove those from the results page, which we're going to cover on the next couple slides here. So one of the ways that we control how bots crawl your website is by updating your Robotstxt file. This is a file on your site that every site should have. If you don't have one, you should create one. But I do want to note that this is probably one of the most, if not the most powerful tool to use in crawling and indexing your website. So if you're not familiar with it, definitely make sure you have an SEO or web developer help you. If you're not careful, you can completely remove your website from search engines. So again, just treat this with great caution because you probably don't want to remove your entire site. So I have two examples here of basic Robotstxt files. So this first one here is what I was just mentioning. Bots are not going to crawl a single page on your site. You can kind of think of the Robotstxt file as a map, and you can consider the user agent is the bot, or in this case, the traveler. In the disallow is like a gate. It's telling the bots you cannot go past here. So again, here what we're telling the bots is we don't want you to crawl any pages on the website. You might be asking yourself, okay, why would I ever want to do this? A lot of times we use this for development or testing sites because again, it's a duplicate of your main site. We do not want Google to crawl and see those pages. Otherwise, you're gonna have a lot of duplicate content issues. So the second section down here, you'll see that there are some disallows. But what we're telling the bots is that you can go crawl pages, other pages on the site, just don't crawl these ones. So this is what you want your site's Robotstxt file to look like. You may not need as many disallows. Again, this is just an example. But again, you'll want to make sure that if you are disallowing pages, it's for sure pages that you don't want crawled. And we also have the sitemaps listed down here, which I'm going to talk more about sitemaps in a second. But if we're using the analogy of a map here, you can kind of consider the sitemap your road signs, right? This is telling Google, please go crawl these pages. These are the important ones that I do want indexed. So if you don't have your sitemap listed in your robots.txt, make sure to get that updated as well. So what is a sitemap? Again, these are kind of the endpoints or destinations on the map. You can see that there's a list of URLs here. These are URLs that we do want crawled and we do want them indexed. So there's a couple different types of sitemaps. This example here is an XML sitemap, which is probably the most common type. And again, you should definitely have one of these on your site. If you don't know where to find it, you can ask your web developer or check your robots.txt. Hopefully it's there. And you can see here, again, it's just a list of pages. This sitemap also has notated the number of images. It also has a last modified date. These aren't required pieces by any means, but again, the more information you give the search engines, the better. And there's also what's known as a TXT sitemap. This is a little bit more simple. It's just a straight up list of URLs. So it would kind of look like this over here. It wouldn't have the images and last modified. Either version's totally acceptable for the search engines. It's really just whatever your site is built on might default to one or the other. And again, you want to keep an eye on your sitemap regularly, because if you're adding and removing pages pretty consistently, you just want to be conscious that your sitemap file is being updated with the website. In some cases, it's not dynamic and you have to manually remove or add pages, which is kind of a pain in the butt. But if it needs to be done that way, then you want to make sure that that's being reflected there. Otherwise, again, the search engines could miss those pages. The other type of sitemap is an HTML sitemap. And so this one is more so for users, although it does have some benefits for the search engines. This is different from a XML or TXT sitemap, as it's a link on your website for users to find. Typically, it's linked in the footer, and it should contain a list of all the links on your website similar to the XML and TXT. And this can be really beneficial if you have a large site with a lot of pages. In this example, I used Microsoft. Obviously, that's a very, very large site. This is a small portion of their HTML sitemap. But again, can be helpful if users get lost and they're just not sure where to go. This can be helpful for them. It does also help the bots crawl some of the other links on your site. So beneficial for both there. And then once you know where your XML or TXT sitemap is located, you should submit it to Google Search Console and Bing Webmaster Tools so that they go crawl and index it. If you ever change your sitemap location, make sure to update it here as well. And then I would just recommend checking every once in a while that the sitemaps have been successfully crawled. You'll see here that this one was crawled. You'll see it has 145 URLs. Probably want to spot check that and say, okay, is that how many are actually in my sitemap? And you can see the last date it was read. Again, you want to make sure that that's done on a semi-regular basis. And again, same thing with Bing. You'll see this one says status processing. So you'd want to come back and make sure that it gets indexed. It will also flag errors for you if there's any pages that it doesn't think should be indexed. So again, just keep an eye on this regularly because you want to make sure that the bots aren't having a hard time finding these links. Okay. So now that we understand how bots crawl and index your site, you're probably asking if there's a way to improve how bots actually understand your website content. There is, and it's known as structured data or schema markup. Structured data is important because it helps the search engines understand and categorize the content on your website. So there's thousands of types of schema out there, and this type of schema that works best for your site just really depends on your business, what type of content you're putting out there. If you have events listed on your page or on your site, if you have blog pages, there's lots of different types of content out there. So it just depends on what it is that your site has listed on it. And this is becoming a more and more important part of SEO as the search engines, Google in particular, are starting to really personalize the search results. And they're also starting to utilize SERP features, which I'll talk more about those in a moment. So if you're brand new to schema, you're not really sure what it is, you can use the structured data markup helper tool to kind of get a better understanding. So we're going to look at a live example here. I've come to the tool. I'm using Dinosaur Barbecue, which is a restaurant based in Syracuse, New York. They have a couple other locations. If you're in New York and you've never had Dinosaur Barbecue, highly recommend it. So in this case, I want to use the restaurant schema. And then I'm going to start tagging. And you'll see that it brings up the main homepage here. And on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's different elements that I can tag. So let's just say, for example, I'm going to tag this, and then I select what option. Obviously, this is an image, so I'm going to select image, and you'll see that it populates over here on the right-hand side. As I scroll down, let's say that I want to tag the Harlem location. I highlight all of this, and it's a city locality, so I'm going to tag that. And again, you'll see that it populates there. And then what you want to do is fill out as much of this other information as you can. If you don't have reviews on your site, for example, you might not be able to, but again, the more information that we can give, the better. So once I've tagged all of these items, I'm going to click Create HTML. And you'll see that it outputs here what's known as the JSON LD format. And you'll see it is code that goes on your site, but it's a lot easier to read, right? For us as humans, this is a lot more clear than that gobbledygook we were looking at on an earlier slide. You can see very clearly that it's a restaurant. Here's a link to an image. It has a location in Harlem. So again, it helps us read and understand the code, and it also helps the bots read and understand the code. And so then what you can do is actually download it and upload it right to your site from here. I'd also add that there's a lot of plugins out there, depending on what your CMS is, that can help you implement schema on your site. So there's a lot of different options out there, but this tool is really nice just for kind of getting a feel for what items should be marked up. Each schema type is going to be a little bit different. So I use the restaurant example here, but that's going to be different from, say, recipe schema or event schema. It's just different things that need to be marked up. So this can just kind of help you get a baseline understanding of what schema is, what items should be marked up, etc. Okay, so I mentioned SERP features. So here's an example of a couple different types of SERP features. So on the left here, we search for pancakes, and you can see that there's some star ratings outputting here. Now, a recipe with 4.6 stars on average with almost 13,000 reviews is probably a pretty good pancake recipe. So I'm much more likely to click this than just some other random link in the search results that I'm not really sure if it even has a star rating or how good it is, all that stuff. So you can also see here that these cards output with different recipes. So it has the image, it has the name, it's got the review schema down here. So again, these are all items in the search results that are much more likely to get clicks than, say, the plain old blue link is what we refer to, just an organic result as. So schema can help you break into some of these SERP features. We also have on the right-hand side here featured snippets, which are increasingly common for all types of queries. And sometimes they'll look a little bit different. This one is using a numbered list. Sometimes it'll be in a table format. Sometimes it'll be in a paragraph format. Sometimes it will have an image. Sometimes it won't. So they always look kind of different. But you can see here again, I'm much more likely to click on this than I am to scroll down and click on an organic link. We also have the people also ask. So if I were to drop this down, it would show me a little snippet of content, and it would also give me a link to click through. So again, these are becoming much more common. There's other types of SERP features as well. These are just some high-level ones. And implementing schema can help you get featured in some of these. And you might be asking, why is it important? Is it really worth it to go through all this effort? And I just want to share an example of a client in the e-learning space who recently earned a featured snippet for a very popular term, and their organic traffic increased by 121% in just 1 month. So obviously it can have huge impacts on your organic traffic if you're able to break into some of these SERP features. Now, if you're not sure if your site already has structured data, or let's say you implemented the structured data, but you're just not sure if it's working right, I'd encourage you to use the rich results testing tool. This can help you identify if there's any issues with your schema. So in this example here, I was looking at that old-fashioned pancakes recipe. You'll see that the breadcrumb schema is not working properly. There's errors that we need to fix. The other types of schema are working. They have this little green check mark, but there's some warnings. Generally, the warnings mean there's items that you could mark up that you didn't. It will still show in the search results, but again, the search engines want as much information as possible. So I would definitely, in this case, address those errors if I want the breadcrumb schema to work, and then turn my attention to the warnings and say, okay, can I fill out these items in the structured data? Can I not? And sometimes you can't, and that's okay. Again, the warnings are just that, a warning. Okay, I know that was a lot of heavy technical coding type information, so the rest of the presentation should be much more digestible. So next we're going to talk about user experience. And this has become an increasingly important piece of the technical SEO puzzle because the recent Google algorithm updates have very much been geared towards rewarding sites that have a positive user experience and penalizing sites that have poor user experience. So in the previous slides, we covered a lot of technical items, which again, I would say are best handled by an SEO expert and a web developer. In the next section, we're also going to want to get a web designer involved because that becomes a really important piece of your team of marketing experts. So we're going to stop here and do a poll. And the question here is, have you or someone on your team prioritized making sure each page on your site has a positive mobile user experience, and the responses are yes, no, and not sure. So we'll give everybody a minute or two to fill that out. All right, so it looks like we have a mix of results here, but it does seem like most of you are prioritizing mobile, which is great. And for those of you who maybe aren't or aren't sure, we'll talk about why it's important and some of the steps that you can take to get there on these next few slides. So first, we're going to talk about securing your website. So HTTP stands for Hypertext Transport Protocol, and it allows for information to be passed between web servers and clients. The S in this case stands for secure. And if your website's not secure, it means any information a user inputs on the page, which could include things like their name, address, credit card details, are not protected and they could be stolen. On secure websites, the code's encrypted so that the sensitive information cannot be traced. So having a secure website does give you a small ranking boost, but I'd say more importantly, it gives your users that feeling of security, that they're giving their information and it's going to be protected. Web browsers like Chrome are also getting a lot more aggressive about letting users know if they're on a non-secure website. So you can see here the eventual treatment of all non-secure pages in Chrome is going to look like this, which to a user can be pretty scary, especially if they're inputting credit card information. So you can look at your site in your web browser and see, does it have this little lock here? Does it say not secure? And that will tell you whether your site is secure or not. Again, you can also look if your site starts with HTTP, that is not secure. HTTPS means that it is secure. So that S is what you're looking for there. And again, this can be the difference between a user converting or not converting. So what people are much more weary nowadays of giving their information on a site that's not secure. And especially if you run an e-commerce site where somebody's giving over their credit card information, it's extraordinarily important to make sure that your site is secure. Page speed has also been a major ranking factor since about July of 2018. And the reason it's a ranking factor is because it has huge impacts on the user experience. Users are much more likely to leave a website with a slow loading time. You can see in this chart over here, even a few seconds makes a huge difference on the probability of a user bouncing away from your site. So you can use tools like Google PageSpeed Insights to test and improve your page speed and get recommendations. So look at another live example here. I used Macy's as our example, pretty large, popular, well-known retailer, very heavily browsed site, most likely. So you can see here the PageSpeed Insights tool, which is the one that is recommended by Google to use to evaluate your page speed. There are other tools out there like Pingdom and GTmetrix, lots of tools out there. This is the one that Google recommends, so that's why this is the one that we generally use as our baseline. And you can see here I can tab between mobile and desktop. So on desktop, our page speed is actually pretty good. You can see that Google gives you a rating on a scale of 100. And I would note here that getting in the 90 to 100 range is extraordinarily difficult. I think I've worked with one client ever who was in that range, and they put a lot of time and resources into improving their page speed. So again, I would say in this case, a 63 is that's pretty decent. But you can see that there's still lots of recommendations if we scroll down here. You can see a full list of diagnostics that the tool runs. And then you can see what some of the opportunities are. So how can we improve? How can we, get this maybe in the 70s or 80s? In this case, we want to remove JavaScript and eliminate render blocking resources. So if you scroll up here, you'll get some data around around your site's speed performance. And I'm going to chat a little bit more about these in a second here when we talk about core web vitals. But at kind of a basic level, first contentful paint is the first time that the user can actually see something pop up on your website. So it's not just the browser spinning. Time to interactive is how long does it take for you to actually be able to, scroll and click on things. Largest contentful paint is similar to first contentful paint, but it's the biggest piece here. So again, these are kind of technical items, but you can see that it looks at each one and kind of gives you a grade for that. So you'll see the red here probably needs some work. Yellow is okay. Green means that it passes. And you'll see for mobile, it's very similar. And you'll also notice the mobile score here is a lot worse. That's extremely common. It's not often that I see desktop slower than mobile for a variety of reasons. But again, it gives you kind of the same information here. It gives you, again, some opportunities for how you can improve. The ones at the top with the big scary red bar are the ones that can have the most impact, right on down to some of the smaller impactful recommendations. So again, unless you're a developer, this is more than likely something that's above your pay grade. So you'll want to get a developer involved in helping you to improve page speed if there are some opportunities here. All right. So I mentioned Core Web Vitals, and this is a report, again, that you can find in your Google Search Console. It's going to give you a mobile result and a desktop result. And this is a relatively new concept in the SEO world. Google announced very recently that Core Web Vitals is going to become a ranking signal in 2021. You might say, okay, well, that's several months away. Why am I worrying about it? That's because Google very rarely gives us that much of a heads up that an update is coming. And so that means it's a big one. It's going to be extraordinarily important. So as you're reviewing the Core Web Vitals report, you'll notice that it has some of those similar items as the page speed insights. So the largest contentful paint, speed index, things like that. And these metrics are related to page speed, also to responsiveness. So we'll talk a little bit more about mobile responsiveness in a minute here. But again, it's not in play yet, but it's going to be shortly. And again, you'll want to start addressing this as soon as possible because there's some pretty technical items here that can take a developer some time to work through. And you'll want to make sure that you're doing testing and making sure that these improvements aren't impacting other elements on your site, specifically images. Images tend to have a big impact on page speed. So if you want to make sure that it's not going to impact other areas of your site. So again, want to start looking at that sooner rather than later. Okay, so you can also use Google Analytics, which has some very powerful user experience data. There are other analytics tools as well you might be using. In Google Analytics, you'll want to look at the audience overview section. So you'll see here it gives us some high-level KPIs. The ones that I would focus on as far as user experience goes are pages per session, which is the number of pages on average that people are viewing in one session. So in this case, you can see it's about 1.5, which means sometimes people are going to another page, sometimes they're not. Average session duration, which is how long does it last on average. You can see here it's about a minute. And then bounce rate, which is probably the most misunderstood and misused metrics in Google Analytics. So a bounce rate is defined as when a user comes to a page, doesn't take any other action. They don't click on anything. They don't, use a link or an image or anything like that. They immediately leave. Now, the reason that bounce rate can tend to be, misunderstood is that some people think, oh, every bounce is bad. And that's not necessarily true. So if we dive into page-specific behavior statistics, so again, you can see here we're looking at a landing page report. So each page has its own average bounce rate, pages per session, and average session duration. And you'll notice that some of these pages have a much higher bounce rate than others. In particular, blog posts. So for example, the one on line 3 here and the one on line 10 here have pretty high bounce rates. 90 plus is a pretty significant bounce rate. But you'll notice this one in particular has an average session duration of over a minute. What does that mean? That means that even though users aren't actually clicking to another page, they are reading and digesting your content, which is still a positive signal. So again, it's important to take these metrics with kind of a grain of salt. I'd also encourage you to look at each section on your site and say, okay, is it the blog pages that have high bounce rates? Does our homepage have a high bounce rate? Because that's probably not a good thing. Your homepage should be one of your lower bounce rate pages. So again, you'll just want to look at these based on a per page level and not necessarily panic at the overall numbers. Heat mapping or click tracking software can also help you see how users interact with your pages. You can see where they're clicking, how far they're scrolling down, lots of other things. Some tools will allow you to do user recordings where you can actually watch users as they navigate and move around your site. And so these are really helpful in identifying any usability hiccups that might pop up. It's also going to allow you to see, okay, in the scroll map example over here, you can see about 50% of users are only getting past the first paragraph of content. So we want to make sure any really important information or calls to action are above that section. So again, it can help improve your usability, allow you to get a better understanding of how users are moving around the site and what elements that they're clicking, what elements they're not clicking. If there's really important things we want them to be interacting with, then we'd want to find a way to highlight those or unhighlight them if they're not as important. All right, so we've talked quite a bit up until now about mobile specific, and the reason that having a mobile friendly website is important is because the amount of traffic on mobile is continuing to rise. More and more people are browsing on mobile, and desktop traffic is staying pretty flat, and desktop is still obviously important, but Google is actually crawling the mobile version of your site first. This was known as mobile first indexing, and it's been kind of a slow rollout over the last couple of years. But again, it's important to have a mobile friendly website, not just for your users who are actually going to be the ones clicking and interacting, but because the search engines are also crawling your mobile version of your site. So it's going to be really difficult if you do not have a mobile friendly website to rank well. And you're also going to have probably pretty high bounce rates because users are going to get very frustrated very quickly. So you'll see here I have two examples. On the left hand side here, this is the HawkSEM website. You can see it's a very clean layout, easy to read. The fonts are bigger. I can pretty clearly see elements that I can click here. Whereas on Mile High Comics, I can't even read what some of these items are. I'd have to zoom in. The links aren't very big. I'm probably gonna click the wrong link. So again, very poor user experience there. And you can test your site's mobile friendliness using the Google Mobile Friendly Test Tool. And again, best practice nowadays is to have a responsive website. There's lots of different devices that are lots of different sizes out there. And so you want your website to adjust based on the size of the screen the user is using. Back in the day, people used to use a separate mobile website. Typically, it was an M.dot site. That's no longer best practice. If you are using that, you should definitely upgrade your site to be responsive. And again, you can test this using the mobile friendly test tool. And it will also give you some recommendations if your site's not mobile friendly, what you can do to improve on that. So again, it's not just enough for your site to be responsive. Your site should also have a positive mobile user experience. Mobile users are very fickle and they'll bounce quickly if they can't find what they're looking for, or they're having trouble navigating, and they'll probably head over to one of your competitor sites. So you'll want to make sure that your mobile site is well designed, that it's very clear where users should be navigating to. And I find that a lot of people in the marketing world forget to look at their site on mobile, or they don't do it very frequently because we're usually working on desktops. And so I think it's an important step for everybody to just take a few minutes and look at browser site on mobile. Just kind of click through, scroll around, see if there's any things that stand out to you as, oh, this is not great, we need to improve on this. You can also see usability issues in Google Search Console with the mobile usability report. You'll see a couple examples here of clickable elements are too close, or content is wider than the screen. Those are indications that there's some responsive issues. So again, lots of tools out there to help you identify some of these issues and get them cleaned up. All right, so now we're going to talk about website architecture. And the first piece in this section is navigation. Navigation, again, is important for your user experience, but it's also important for the search engines. We talked earlier about how the search bots crawl your sitemap and they crawl other links on your website, but they also use your navigation as an indicator of how important certain pages are on your site. And so generally what I recommend, if you're looking at your navigation or thinking maybe you want to redesign it, or if you're redesigning your site, it's a perfect opportunity to look at your navigation. And so a couple recommendations here: making sure that your important pages are linked as tier 1 items, but you also don't want to go crazy with the tier 1 items. You want to make sure there's no more than 7 typically. If you have a really, really large site, there may be exceptions to that rule. but generally you want to keep the tier 1 navigation as clean as possible. Otherwise, users are going to get overwhelmed very quickly. I also don't generally recommend linking tier 4 pages and beyond. We'll talk about what those tiers look like in a second here, but even tier 3 can be a lot sometimes. Again, if you have a large website, it probably does make sense, but if you only have a website that's a couple hundred pages, having a tier 3 or tier 4 section is just, it's excessive. So you'll want to make sure that your important pages are linked in your navigation, but you don't want to go crazy. Otherwise, you're going to overwhelm users. And you'll also want to consider your mobile navigation. So when we looked at that screenshot of the HawkSEM mobile site, you probably saw that there was the hamburger menu. That's really common to have on the mobile layouts because you don't have enough room on mobile to list out all of your tier 1 items. So that's a pretty common way around it. There's other ways as well. And we'll look at an example here in a second. And footer navigation is also important. And I find this is the piece that people sometimes forget about. Your footer navigation lives on every page of your site. So again, when the bots are crawling, they're crawling your footer links. That does not mean you should go and spam your footer with every link on your site, but it's just important to keep in mind. So a couple of best practices: remember to link your privacy policy. The bots are looking for it. And users obviously need to be aware of where it is too, and that's generally where people are going to go look. Again, it can be used for important links that don't fit in the header. For example, maybe customer service links or things like that, where a user who's been to your site before would probably know to go look in the footer for them. I also recommend including local information if that's applicable, because that's a strong signal to the search engines when you're doing local SEO that they know where it is that you're located. And also linking to social profiles if that's applicable. Again, these are strong signals to the search engine that you're a legitimate business, and also gives your users an opportunity to go check out your social profiles if you have them. So when we talk about tiers, I wanted to give an example here of what a good site navigation looks like. So we're using Zappos as the example, and you'll see up here are the tier 1 items. Very simple, very easy to understand, very clean. And then as we open up each section, there's subsections. So under women, we've got shoes, clothing, more. It's actually much larger than this. It just all wouldn't fit in the screenshot. And then we've got the tier 3 items. So under shoes, it gets even more specific. And if you think about it, you probably could get even more specific than this, right? If you wanted to list out, you know, red heels or high heels or 2-inch heels, whatever it is, it can probably get more specific. But again, we don't want to overwhelm the users. So a very clean, simple layout, even if you have a lot of links and you have a large site, can help with the user experience. Again, it's also going to help the bots better crawl. The other thing I want to mention here is that there's a search functionality up here, which I think is really important. Again, especially if you have a large website. Some users might be browsing around quite a bit before they decide what it is that they're going to actually buy or what forms they want to submit, whatever. And having the search function allows those users to very quickly search for what it is that they want and go find it. They don't have to click through every single navigation element to get where they know they want to go. So I would definitely encourage, if you don't have an on-site search option already, to have one built into your site. And then we talked about mobile. So again, this is that hamburger layout that I was referencing. You'll see that the structure looks very similar to desktop in terms of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 items. But again, it's designed specifically for mobile, and it's easy to use, easy to click. The links aren't super tiny. So again, just make sure when you're designing your navigation that you do keep mobile in mind. And here's an example of a footer. This is a pretty large footer from Lego. You'll see that down here, again, they have their privacy policy, cookies, all that sort of stuff that has to be linked somewhere, but we don't want it junking up the top navigation. We've also got some support links down here. They have a search function. They link to their social profiles, so some of those things we were talking about. So again, just keep in mind as you're designing your navigation that your footer can be a great place to put some of those links that are still important, but there's just no room for them up top, and they're just not necessarily best for the user experience. And so the other piece when we talk about website architecture that I think often gets forgotten is internal linking. So again, when the bots are crawling your content, they're following any links that are on your page. That includes internal and external. And so you want to make sure you're using internal links to help guide the bots to some of those important pages on your site. I would note that you usually don't need to link to your homepage via an internal link. Your homepage is probably going to be your highest authority page anyway. So when you're using internal links, make sure you're linking to internal content, whether that's product pages, blogs, etc. And also make sure you're using keywords. You'll see in this example here, the anchor text, we refer to the text here as anchor text, has good keywords in it. It's not generic like learn more or click here, because again, the bots use that anchor text to help determine what the content is on the page that you're linking to. So if you're using generic text, they have no idea and they can't really help you. All right, so URL structures. There's some best practices that I have listed over here on the right-hand side as far as what your URL structure should look like, and a couple of examples. This IMDb example, you can see just by looking at this link, I have no idea what the content is on this page. I don't know what this is referring to. It's just a mess of letters and numbers. And so it's just not super clear to me what it is. It's also not clear to the search engine. So you want to try to make sure that you use keywords if possible in your URLs. Don't go and spam your URLs with keywords. But you'll see in this example here of what a good URL structure might look like, it's pretty clear that this blog is about a content audit. So you also want to make sure, you'll see this one has a subfolder for blog. Again, I would generally recommend your URL structures follow your navigation structure. So if you have a lot of product pages, like this example down here, you might have several different layers of navigation before you get to the actual product. Like that Zappos example that we looked at. So some of these URLs are going to be longer depending on, you know, what your site structure looks like. But generally, I'd recommend just mirroring what's on your navigation. I'd also recommend keeping it as short as possible. And you'll see I call this a good example. It's a pretty long URL that's going to happen, but generally it's better to keep it shorter. You'll also want to avoid using underscores. Bots ignore underscores. It doesn't look like anything to them. So if you were to use underscores instead of hyphens, it would think that this was a misspelt word because it doesn't see spaces the way that humans do. So yeah, again, I think especially if you are using something like this, where you're just using random letters and numbers, or it's just not clear what it is that your page content is about, you'll want to take a look at adjusting some of those URL structures. You'll also want to make sure that your URLs are not flat. So for example, if blog was not here and it was just hawksem.com/content audit steps, every single URL was at the root, Google doesn't know what your more important pages are, and it doesn't understand what your site architecture looks like. So again, it's important to make sure that you're using subfolders as it's relevant. And then I quickly just want to touch on duplicate content. So this is a black hat SEO tactic that can get you penalized in the search results if you're not careful. Although sometimes it does happen by mistake, especially with e-commerce sites. In this example of a wine product, the CMS has spit out a couple different versions of the same page and they all have different URLs. Guess which one is the good URL structure? It's this one right here. And if Google is crawling all of these pages, it doesn't know which one you actually want to rank. So it doesn't rank either of them. So if you have duplicate content going on your site from within your site, you want to make sure that you use what's known as a rel canonical tag to indicate to the search engines which page you actually want to be considered the authoritative one, the one that you want to rank. If you are copying content from other websites, for example, let's say your CEO is featured in a Forbes article, that's also duplicate content and can get you penalized, especially if you're trying to compete with Forbes. So if you still want to post that type of content on your website to share with your audience, you can use what's known as a no index tag And that's a signal to the search engines that says, I don't want this page indexed in the search results. It's just going to live here for users to find. So again, within the code, there's ways to help clean up some of this duplicate content. If you don't want to actually remove it from your site, which is generally what I'd recommend, there's some options out there that can help you get around the duplicate content issues. And the last item we're going to talk about here is headlines and title tags. And this is important because almost 40% of SEO experts think this is the most important SEO element. So again, some recommendations here when you're thinking about your page titles and meta descriptions. You want to use keywords, especially in the page titles. Page titles have a huge impact on your rankings, and you can see big increases or decreases if you're making changes to your page titles. So definitely want to make sure that you're using keywords there. Meta descriptions don't necessarily have a direct impact on your rankings, but you'll notice here, if my query was by puppy, you'll see that puppy is bolded each time that it appears. So this can help with your click-through rate if you have keywords in your meta description. Always use pipes or hyphens if you need to separate words. You can see that these are done here in a couple different examples. I'd also recommend keeping your page titles under 60 characters and your meta descriptions under 155. You'll notice sometimes Google will output a longer meta description. There's really no hard and fast rule on how many characters a meta description would be, but under 155 is generally safe. If your page title goes too long, it will get it cut off, and so the user can't read the whole thing. So you want to make sure you stay under 60 characters for that, especially for mobile since the screen is smaller. And then again, I just want to note here, we were talking about URL structures. Google actually outputs the URL above the page title now. It used to be underneath down here, but that's changed recently. So again, reasons that your URL structure is important is because users can actually kind of see the layout here, and you want to make sure that it's clean and easy to read. All right, so I realize that was a lot of information. So I want to give an opportunity here for everybody to ask some questions. So Caroline, I will turn it over to you if you want to pick out some questions for me to answer.
Thanks, Justine. Yeah, that was a great presentation. And so before we do the Q&A, I'm going to just launch one last poll. Like Justine said, we went through a lot here. So this is just whether or not you would like a free SEO analysis from HawkSEM, and I'm going to have this running in the background while we jump into the Q&A. So we have a few questions that I'm going to jump right into, and for everyone here, if you have questions, you can still type them into the Q&A box. So first off, Daniel asked, when you were talking about the index pages, how do you find index pages with a site colon search?
So if you just type in site colon your domain. So for example, with HawkSEM, it's site colon HawkSEM.com. If you're using subdomains, so let's say that you have a subdomain that you don't want indexed and ones that you do. If you don't have the subdomain within the site search, it's going to show all of the pages. So that's what I generally would recommend doing, is don't include, let's say if you use www, you don't need to include that when you do the site search. But yeah, if you just type site colon search for your domain, it should show up.
And you type that into the Google search box?
Yep, exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, great. And so Vanessa asked, how do I check my website for Robotstxt?
That's a great question. If you go to your domain, so again, hawksem.com/robots.txt.
Perfect. Okay, great. And then Jordan asked, if a user doesn't click on anything, but they do scroll down through a page, will the session count as a bounce?
That depends on if you have what's known as event tracking in place in your Google Analytics profile. And this is why bounce rate tends to be kind of a misconstrued metric, is that some websites use a lot of event tracking. And if an event is triggered, say you have some events in place for triggering if the user scrolls, it's not going to count that as a bounce. However, if you do not have that event tracking in place and the user doesn't click a single place, then that would count as a bounce. However, the search engines can understand how long the person was on that page if they're scrolling. So they don't necessarily have to click for it to be triggered as a bounce, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay. And then I also have something from Mariella. She asks, does redirecting the type of content help avoid duplicating content? Like, for example, linking to Forbes and then redirecting to the page.
So if you are taking down, let's say you have duplicate content on your site and you say, I don't need this here, I just want to get rid of it, then you should definitely redirect the page that you're removing to whichever page it is that you want to rank. If you're using the Forbes example, that's a little trickier since it's difficult to put a redirect in place to a third-party website. That makes sense. It's much easier to put a redirect to your own site, like moving pages around on your own site. So I hope I answered the question. I think that's a very specific example. I'd have to look at it to be able to make a recommendation there.
Gotcha. No worries. Yeah. So if no one has any other questions, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to join us today. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to reach out to us at info@hawksem.com. And again, we should be sending out the recording within 24 to 48 hours. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. And you can see more info on that on the next slide. And hopefully a lot out of this and have some tangible takeaways to bring back to your team. And remember, you can request a free, no obligation SEO analysis from us at HawkSEM after this is over by heading to hawksem.com/SEO audit. And that's it, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.